Hi, everybody. It's good to have you all on board with us tonight. Thanks so much for attending.
Hello, Hells.
Awesome. Hello, Shones. So to those of you watching, thank you and welcome. We're extremely excited. And I think for all of us, whether you're a current athlete, whether you're a coach, a supportive spouse, these are really, really important topics that we want to share tonight. So before I get too far and too detailed into why we're here tonight, I think it's a good opportunity to introduce who we've got with you tonight. My name is Hayley Nixon. I'm based in Durban, South Africa. I'm a paddler and a biokineticist sort of by career, but I'm joined by a host of very impressive people. So I'm going to start you off with Shona Hendricks, who is powered along and part of our Coach Parry team. Shona is head of athlete success with Coach Parry, also a qualified and well-experienced sports scientist, and has been head of sports science at the University of Pretoria for the last few years, well, up until recently. So Shones, it's a privilege to have you here, and I'm looking forward to you introducing the rest of our panel.
Thanks, Hales. Happy to be here. And a couple of things that Hayley is leaving out of her conversation there is that she is also, while her career has come from rowing, she has recently been crowned the World Surfski Champion. So she has got not just a rowing career, but she also, was fighting towards the Olympics, but also is now currently World Surfski Champion. Those of you who follow the G Sports Awards, she was recently named the Athletes of the Year. So we're really, really excited to have Hales as our host tonight, and looking forward to having her expertise both as an athlete and a coach and host, and also, she's a soon-to-be mom as well. And then welcoming on, and you'll see her on your screen, is Doc Phatho Zondi. Privileged to have worked with Doc Zondi I've never called you that, Doc Zondi. I've called you Doc Phatho for years and years, but I'm going to read this out because it's just good to do this. As a well-established sports and exercise medicine physician by trade and an avid runner and mountain biker at heart. I think that's the other way around, Doc. You're an avid runner by heart and a mountain biker second to that, but let me not do that. Yeah, her clinical expertise lies in injury prevention and management, and these things have allowed her to accompany athletes to Olympic Games, Paralympic Games, and Commonwealth Games. Dr. Phatho also holds numerous leadership, advisory, and governance positions. And I didn't actually know this, which is awesome for me to announce. In 2017, she was awarded the Ministerial Recognition Award by the South African government for her contribution to advancing sports in South Africa. So, I mean, that in itself is excellent. So welcome, Doc. Nice to have you here as well. And then, we also are lucky enough to have Ann Ashworth with us. Ann is an ultra-distance athlete, a full-time advocate, and a member of the Johannesburg Bar, so clearly excels both in athletic ability and academic and career-wise. But she's also captain of Team Massmart, and Team Massmart is the only, was the first and only ladies-only elite ultra-distance running team. And she says that she lives in KZN as well. What she's leaving out of that is her expertise is that she is the Comrades Marathon champion from 2018 and an excellent runner as well. So Anne, thanks for joining us. And I mean that's a lot of chatting, and we really want to get into the nitty-gritty of things. But I feel so very, very privileged to have all these females, and what a panel that we have, Hales.
Said there's a wealth of knowledge, but there's also a lot of experience. So thanks everyone for joining us, and I think what's important is that we get to the content and the focus of tonight. We've got quite a lot to cover, and we're hoping to cover as much as we can on all of it, but of course we might find that we spend a bit more time in certain areas. So again, I stress, please add in your questions, add in your comments, so we can get to those as well if and when or before we move on to a new topic. So I think probably the most pivotal sort of discussion we want to have is in and around the menstrual cycle specifically. And there's a lot we want to chat there with regarding the taboo around it, but also if and when we know about our menstrual cycle, how we can train more efficiently and more effectively, sort of using that knowledge instead of just being completely unaware. So we will tackle a lot of that. From there, we're going to lead towards the red S or the red syndrome, which Shona will go into more detail. And everything that's associated with that, whether it be low energy deficiency, whether it be bone mineral density, et cetera. So we'll go into quite a bit of detail around red S, where it's come from and why it is now termed red S. Obviously, a huge part of that is going to be nutrition, and I know Anne has got a lot of experience and a lot of really good content to share with us on that. And I think sort of, the last two that we'd like to touch on relates around contraception. And we know that as adult female athletes, contraception is really important. So we just want to look at why you're choosing the contraception you're on and possibly get a little bit more of the physiological background from someone like Doc Phatho, just on, why we should make those choices and not just kind of take what we assume is the best one. If we can have a little bit more knowledge, we can be a little bit more empowered. So like I say, quite a lot to get through. Really, really important topics that we possibly haven't discussed enough in the past. And it's brilliant that we're now having these conversations. So thanks to Coach Perry for hosting this, and we look forward to it this evening. Just to keep in mind, as I said earlier, house rules, if I can keep it, or if I can call it that. Keep those questions coming, please, as and when you have them, and we will filter through them and try and answer them as best we can. And secondly, we are going to be running, I think, 3 polls throughout the webinar. And basically what that'll be is just questions directed to you as the athlete or coach. And we'd love you to engage with your answers so that we can give some feedback and get some stats on those questions that come through. All right, so welcome, and thanks to all of you for joining us tonight. So, Shones, first and foremost, we are going to start off with the menstrual cycle. Now, obviously, it's a hugely important conversation, but if you would like to start us off, and obviously we'll have our other panel members come in, why is it so important to be aware of our menstrual cycle as females or as coaches of female athletes? And just talk to us a little bit about this idea of tracking our menstrual cycle and what the importance is behind that.
Yeah, thanks. I think we've come from an area where it's quite a taboo topic, right? It's not something that we tend to talk about. It's always quite an embarrassing idea, and no one really speaks about it. And I don't know, I think, I did a little bit of reading, and one of the things that came up was, I think when women started to become a little bit more prevalent in the workplace, one of the things was that we wanted to be equal, right? We wanted this equality, but you didn't want things to impact that. So we didn't speak about things that maybe would make us seem not equal. So I think that's how it's almost happened. And as a result, we don't speak about it. And for the most part, I think within sports science or within research, predominantly all the work has been done on male athletes, and in particular male collegiate athletes, so athletes from 18 to 22, and we've almost just taken that then as the truth and then applied that onto females. And I know Doc Phatho will mention some of the studies a little bit later and how that research is done, but a lot of that is we've almost just taken what is done for males and put that on the female athletes. And essentially we have an entirely different physiology and hormonal system. And so I think it's really, really important to realize that we need to perhaps train a little bit differently. And then we'll get into more of this a little bit later, but not necessarily doing things differently or less than or anything like that, but just around working with your menstrual cycle to make sure that we're optimizing things a lot better, I think.
I think, what's becoming important is like you say, is getting rid of the taboo, so that as athletes, we feel that we are comfortable with talking about the menstrual cycle, and that engages on a whole different level, whether you have that relationship with your coach or not, with your teammates, etc. But if we as older athletes or as ambassadors for the sport can be more open about it, it'll make the youngsters feel more confident in talking about it. But it's a bigger picture than that, and it'd be great to hear from Doc on this now. But what the physiology is behind it, why the importance of it. So it's a case of can we change our training to suit it, and can we optimize our performance if we know more about that menstrual cycle, instead of kind of just sticking our head in the sand and just hoping we don't feel bad on race day.
Thanks, Hayley, and Shona, thanks for starting the conversation by saying there's very many ways in which we are similar to men, and a lot of research has been done on that in terms of injuries, training, performance, but there's also ways in which we're distinctly different, and obviously the menstrual cycle is one key way that we are. So I thought perhaps just to start us on, to make sure that we're all at least starting this conversation from the same platform or the same base of understanding, maybe we just need to recoup what we're talking about when we speak about our menstrual cycle. So obviously the menstrual cycle is the monthly hormonal cycle that all females go through, or most females go through, to prepare them for pregnancy. So the significance of understanding your cycle is either so that you can plan your pregnancy or avoid pregnancy. And of course, as Shona has alluded to, right now there's a growing body of evidence, I say cautiously, but certainly interests around how we might adapt our training to accommodate for these changes in hormones and how that may influence our performance and, of course, our training outputs. But really just to make sure that we're all talking from the same hymn sheet, and I won't bore you with this because I will assume that many of us are familiar with the cycle. But essentially, if you look at this diagram, what it shows is in the middle, you see those lines, and those are the key reproductive hormones, the blue one being progesterone, that orange red one being estrogen, and the yellow one being what we call luteinizing hormones. Those are the three that are relevant to our conversation today. What you see at the top is your ovulatory cycle, and what you see at the bottom is essentially what's happening with your uterus and your uterine wall. So day one of your cycle is the first day of your period, and essentially your cycle ends on the first day of your next period. That's how you measure the length of your period. And clinically, really, we speak about three phases when it comes to your ovarian cycle. That's the follicular phase, the ovulation phase, and of course the luteal phase. And then if you look at the bottom, some of you may be familiar with 4 phases of the cycle, and that usually refers to your uterine cycle. And phase 1 being when you menstruate, so those first few days. Phase 2 being what they call the proliferative phase. Phase 3 being ovulation, and then of course the secretory phase being that last phase. And essentially, I think key to this whole process, midway usually is ovulation. Like I said, the first few days is when you menstruate, and the last few days is what you call your luteal phase, and of course leading to your PMS. And we'll speak a little bit about the hormone fluctuations as we progress and engage in our conversation.
I was just going to say, trust the doctor just to bring us up to speed, because I think we sort of assume that everyone has the same amount of content. And I know in my experience as a younger athlete, like I was ignorant about all of the above, as you've just explained. So thanks, Doc. And so Shones, if you can kind of carry on from there, because we know we wanted to just delve into those different phases of the cycle and what their benefits could be. So I'll leave it in the hands of you and Doc.
Yeah, thanks. This popping on webcams on and off, I'm not quite used to it. So sorry for everyone who's watching us flick between many cams. But yeah, I think one of the things has always been, Doc, and I'm keen to also hear your side on this. But we've never, well, not never, and you mentioned that we are starting to talk about this a little bit more. But I think one of the things we've almost just gone through, and we'll bring in Hales and Ann a little bit later around the athlete perspective. But we've almost just expected athletes to kind of deal with their menstrual cycle and kind of carry on. Maybe if you can mention some of the research that's come out. I mean, you and I have both had this discussion around a lot of the research that's out in the science at the moment is saying, no, there is no effect from phase to phase. Correct?
Well, absolutely. So I think we need to be careful about, or very specific rather, about what effect we're talking about. So effect on what? So maybe just as a starting point, I think it's really important to acknowledge that, up to about 80% of females do state that they experience symptoms related to their menstrual cycle. And of course, because female athletes are female first before they're athletes, the research shows that about 75% of females who are what we call eumenoric, in other words, are having their normal menstrual cycle without any contraception, they also report that they experience side effects from their normal menses. So that's normal. So things like cramping, nausea, maybe fatigue, bloating, all of those things. So females experience it, and so do athletes experience it. Now, the importance and the relevant question is, so what, right? So how does it affect our training? How does it affect performance? And is there anything that we should be doing about it? I think from when we had sort of the pre-brief discussion, Anne was sharing some really sort of interesting things about her own experience here. So I think it's really important to sort of draw on the experience of individuals. But fundamentally, Shona, if I just need to reference the research, in terms of the impact of the menstrual cycle on training and performance, the research findings are mixed. So anecdotally, many women and many female athletes will tell you, yes, there's a difference. During the first half of my cycle, I feel like this. During the second half of my cycle, I feel like this. I can distinctly feel when I ovulate, some women will say. And during PMS, because I'm feeling sluggish or bloated, I absolutely feel like I don't have, I don't have the outputs that I normally do in terms of training and performance. But interestingly, the research is inconclusive. So much of the research shows that objectively, and I say objectively, so in other words, we then do specific strength-based tests, there may not be a significant difference, significance being statistically significant. So there may not be a difference. But I think fundamentally, and I think the take-home message here, and would be a great point to bring in, Anne, is to say that people are individuals, right? So individual athletes will respond differently to their cycle. But I think the purpose of this platform is to just make you aware of what could potentially be happening. And if you're experiencing and you can relate some of these symptoms, to start saying, oh, okay, so now here's the things that I can start to do to adapt and then enhance my performance at different phases. So maybe as just a landing stone there, anecdotally, at least, and with some of the research, what they say is the first half of the cycle, this follicular phase, you're still looking at the diagram, is your low hormone cycle. The second half is usually the high hormone cycle. Usually, those who report that there's a difference say that in that first half of the cycle, that's when they're feeling great. That's when they're feeling strong. That's when they can perform at their best. Second half of the cycle, you might need to adapt things a little bit because they're not feeling as strong in terms of energy outputs. And certainly in the PMS phase, that's also where you might need to adapt things in order to at least improve your performance and your tolerance to training.
Yeah, I think, we'll bring Ann in now, but I think, some of the studies that I've read from some of the leading researchers in this field, and you and I have had these conversations around, Kirsty Sale, Georgie Brainfels, and some of the research they're putting out is, it's that I think maybe, there hasn't been the resources. This type of research is hard to do, right? Absolutely. And so the resources have been, to get this kind of research done to the right sort of button, and monitoring menstrual cycles isn't as easy as just kind of doing that from a research perspective. So for sure, I think anecdotally, I think we're all aware that things do change, and we all experience it as women anyways. So perhaps, there goes my notes. So perhaps bringing in Ann, and maybe and even Hales, your experiences as athletes in this, and feeling the differences around, and why are we starting this conversation around why is it important now to start tracking our cycles?
Yeah, so I have mentioned just to you previously that I have had problems hormonally. I've had problems tracking my cycle. I've had problems even having a cycle at different stages. But, I was just going through my notes on a course that was offered by Dr. Stacey Sims online, which I did a couple of months ago, which dealt with, female tracking and hormone tracking and adapting your training to your hormone cycle, which really made a lot of sense to me. But one of the things that stuck out from rereading my notes today was that 45% of women experience the symptoms of PMS. Like, that's quite a high statistic. That's almost half of women experience PMS symptoms. And those are the sort of things that make you a little bit more hesitant sometimes to do your training. So, for example, if, when you have premenstrual symptoms or during your bleeding period, if you're cramping, if you have back pain, if you're a bit bloated, feel a bit lethargic, all those sort of hormonal things that we all complain about, those are things that are going to affect you physically and psychologically in terms of whipping out a training session. If you're in the middle of your period and you have back pain and you have cramping and you just feel generally quite gross, you're not going to want to hit the track and, pull out one of your high intensity speed sessions. You're just not going to want to do it. Never mind physically feeling like you're able to do it. So for 45% of women, and not necessarily every month, but occasionally you're going to have those feelings. And I think that what's important is that we shouldn't feel ashamed about acknowledging that, hey, I've got PMS, I'm not having a good day. Can we change our training around? Are there ways that I can adapt my training accordingly? I've been quite concerned watching on social media and just chatting to athletes generally that there seems to be this approach at the moment where people say, train like a man. Like, why must women train like a man? We can train like a woman and be just as good. Just because we're not men doesn't make us inferior, and we need to get out of thinking like that. But because we are women, sometimes we have to make changes to the way that we train, the way that we cope with everyday life and our bodily functions. And I don't think that that's something that we should shy away from.
I think that's a great opportunity, and if we can, is just to direct our conversation towards a really, really important topic, which is Red S, and just its relationship to the menstrual cycle. And one of the things, and it's popped up, I see it's popped up as a question here, was do female athletes tend to lose their menstrual cycle if their training is excessive? And I'm sure you can answer that, and I know we can all reflect a little bit on that, but what is it? So we're looking at the menstrual cycle as something that's part of our natural cycle, and if and when we do lose it, that is a red flag towards red S. So could you sort of extend a little bit on that, please?
Yeah, so I mean, reds is related to an abnormal hormonal cycle, the interrupted menstruation, where women miss or have irregular periods as a result of primarily low energy availability. So that's when your energy expenditure, either through daily life activities and your training load, exceeds your energy intake. So where you basically are not fueling your body sufficiently to take care of your day-to-day activities as well as all the training that you do. And that's referred to as low energy availability. And when that becomes chronic, so over a sustained period of time and you're a constant state of low energy availability, that's when you then develop RED-S, which is Relative Energy Deficiency in sport. And, you know, there is a perception that it's almost like exercise anorexia, but that's not the case. REDs can be brought on by two things, two sides of the same coin. The first thing is where you're under fueling for your intake, so you are not taking in sufficient energy to accommodate all your energy requirements, and that could be intentional, for example, by dieting. The flip side of the coin is where you suddenly increase your training volume substantially and don't similarly increase your energy intake. So you could be thinking that, hey, I'm going to increase my weekly mileage by X many kilometers a week or X many hours a week, but you don't change your diet to accommodate that increased energy expenditure. So those are the two sort of circumstances that lead to the onset of low energy availability and RED-S. And in my case, I had a bit of the same thing. I was told that I needed to lean up, and I also had a greatly increased training load, chronically underfueled due to the diet that I was following. And over a period of 18 months, just slowly slipped into a state of RED-S, where basically I wasn't able to fuel my day-to-day requirements or my training load with my intake. And that had a whole lot of things associated with it, like, you know, reduced metabolic rate, stopped experiencing any kind of hormone patterns, wasn't menstruating, became vulnerable to stress fractures. You know, there's a whole lot of onsets on with RED-S, which certainly I'm the least qualified here to talk about. I'm sure Doc Phatho can take us through that. But you know, basically, if you're not making sure that you're properly fueling your training load, you are in danger of entering a state of low energy availability. And when that situation becomes chronic, that's when you move into a state of RED-S. And basically, the message here is that if you're not having a period, you need to be concerned that you may be slipping into a state of low energy availability. And that's how you track it. Healthy athletes have regular periods. And so if you're not having a regular period, you really need to take a look at your training load vis-a-vis your energy intake.
Absolutely. I couldn't have described or articulated any better, Anne. And I think the crux really being, assuming you're not on any oral contraceptive or any contraceptive or hormonal intervention, then having a regular period is indicative of a normal and a healthy physiological state. I think that really being the crux. So this celebration of not having a period is, in fact, it shouldn't be a celebration, because what it indicates essentially is that there is a physiological imbalance. And the important thing is, you've described what relative energy deficiency in sports is. I think the important thing is it matters because of the health consequences and because of the performance consequences. So there's a really great infographic that was published in the British Journal of Sports Medicine that I'm going to ask Brad to bring up now, that describes really succinctly exactly what you've said. It was that first one, Brad, with the 3 bars around how you reach a state of energy mismatch. And so what Anne described is when that middle bar there showing that you've got enough energy for your normal daily processes, just remembering that just to stay alive, essentially, you need a certain amount of energy to sustain your metabolic function, and that's that green bar. if you're going to train, you need to consume more energy or more calories in order to sustain that level of activity. And of course, a mismatch, as Anna said, is either you're not eating enough for your training, or you've increased your training without increasing your energy intake. Fundamentally, though, moving on, because Anna's addressed this really well in terms of explaining what the energy deficiency, or how you can get energy deficiency. Importantly, though, if you just move to the next slide, Brad, important to note that the advantage with females is that we get an early signal when we have we have a low energy availability, and our early signal is that we start getting menstrual irregularities, or at least it's one of the reasons, because there are others, that you could not see your normal menses every month. And that was typically why we used to call it this female athlete triad, because it would be an early warning signal that females got, they'd lose their period. We would note that there was an energy imbalance or energy deficiency. Often then it was associated with intentional restriction in diet or nutrients. And the consequence essentially was problems with bone health, so osteoporosis. And so these females would have presented with things like stress fractures. What we do know, as the body of research and literature has increased, and of course a lot of clinical work has been done, is that these are not the only three symptoms or signs to be concerned with. In fact, there are a number of ways in which relative energy deficiency in sports syndrome can present. And importantly, the consequences on health include not just menstrual irregularities, not just problems with bone health, which may manifest as stress fractures or recurrent stress fractures or atypical stress fractures, but people with relative energy deficiency syndrome, which may also occur in men, of course, would present with things like recurrent injuries, injuries that take very long to heal, so longer than normal that you'd expect. They may present with immunological suppression or dysfunction. They present with fatigue. They may present with GI problems. It does affect your exercise tolerance as well. So in other words, cardiovascular problems. Important one is often psychological manifestations of this relative energy deficiency syndrome. So people, as I've said, feeling fatigued, starting to feel quite flat, depressed, mood disturbances, and the list goes on. I think the crux here really just being it matters because of the health and, of course, performance consequences. A really important one also is an inability to perform and achieve your performance targets despite continuous and consistent training.
Okay.
If you can just stay with me for a moment, it's really brilliant to hear this, and if I can have like a layman's term sort of like athlete reflection, it's in some ways horrifying. Like if I think from when I was 14, 15 years old, like we never had this conversation. We didn't have it until the last couple of months maybe. And it's frightening to think how many athletes are out there who are fighting that goal. And I say this with the greatest amount of respect, as trying to be a lean athlete, trying to be a good power to weight ratio, have really good efficiency, but then not be aware of what the long-term damage might be down the road of these calorie restricted diets whilst trying to train so hard. And as Ann said, it's not always conscious that that calorie intake is dropping so low. So you fall into this, maybe this sort of downward spiral of trying to reach a goal weight, but not actually realizing what's happening. And then you're kicking yourself because you're exhausted in the morning and don't want to go to training, but there's all this hormonal stuff in the background. And I think, on the other side of that is if we're not having these conversations about the menstrual cycle, and there's a lot of questions coming through I can see about contraception, and we'll get to that. But if we aren't able to be open with our doctors, with our coaches, with our fellow colleagues and athletes about this conversation, then we're always going to fall into the same trap and make the same mistakes. So it's really, really good to hear from your perspective and to hear from Ann's perspective of what it's doing in the long run and what it's doing, because we're all trying to be better athletes or better coaches. But it feels like we left a whole chapter out of the book.
Absolutely. I'm looking at the poll results here, Hayley, and at least the good news is 30% of the participants who have responded right now, so they at least have heard of relative energy deficiency syndrome in sport. And certainly that goes up to about 42% for those who say, actually, I've heard of it when it was spoken about as the female athlete triad. But still quite concerning, of course, that about 57% of the respondents saying they actually don't know what it is. And not surprisingly, because again, importantly is, firstly, it's not just isolated to females, you know, it occurs in males as well. But I think it's because of the second statement that you said, is that it's not always intentional. So sometimes, and often this happens when you increase your training load over a period of time without increasing your calorie intake to correspond with your training load. And then often it becomes a frustrating and a vicious cycle, right? Because people come to you with these injuries, if as a physician or as a physio, because often they might not present to the physician first, they present to the primary caregiver. You don't pry, you don't dig deep, about, you know, what are you taking in, how's your training load changed, also what's your level of recovery and your quality of recovery. You might miss it. You might end up just treating the injuries. You might end up just in this vicious cycle where a person saying, okay, I need to train harder. But the more I train, it's not like I'm achieving those targets. And this is why it becomes important to have these conversations, to speak about how this might present, so that if you do start to experience these symptoms, you can start to dig deeper, and you can guide your doctor or your physician or your physio to dig deeper.
No, exactly. And rather ask those questions, like rather have it as an option and say, could these be the symptoms of REDS or RED-S? And then look at all the categories that it could fit into. And I think also important that we're making this, you know, not gender specific. That can happen to males as well, which is possibly why it has sort of migrated towards moving away from the female athlete triad. That it's not just, you know, specific to females, but again, probably why we're doing this and why we started with the menstrual cycle is that is such a big key for us. And I know as a young athlete, I was told straight up, get rid of the period. I don't want to hear about it on race day. And that's pretty frightening to be dealt that from your coach. And I don't think it was in an aggressive way. I think it was just no one knew what to do with it or how to deal with it. So the easiest thing was just to not have it. And I think, you know, if we can, maybe we should tap into some of the conversation around contraception. Shones, I don't know if you're going to cut in to say something else before I go that way.
Sorry, I just want to interrupt because I think what Doc is saying is so important very often for the general recreational athletes. It is something that can get missed so easily. But something Ann said to us offline, and I'd love to get your experience in this part before we move on to the contraception stuff, because I know you've spoken so openly about some of your struggles with regards to this, and I know I've read one or two other elite athletes that have mentioned it, but you said something to me last week around how elite athletes, very often when you stop getting your menstrual cycle, it's like this badge of honor, right? You're almost like, oh, I'm no longer getting my period, and so I must be elite now. So I would love to get your kind of idea, your experience from that, and how that's the sort of paradigm shift of thinking and why we need to change that kind of view of thinking.
Yeah, so I mean, my experience or my knowledge, just who I've interacted with, there seem to be sort of three prongs to this attack on, you know, femalehood in the athlete realm. And the first, like I said, is this concept that women need to train like a man. You know, I was told I had to train like a man. I had to run with a man. I had to be a man. You know, so certainly having a period was the last thing on the agenda, because basically I needed to be more dosed up on male hormones than females. I say that dosed up, I don't mean doping, let's just be clear. I just mean, you know, suppressing your female hormones. You know, then the second thing I think is, you know, we all know, particularly in the endurance events, but in any high performing sport event, if you don't have a period, you're working hard. People see it as a standard to achieve to, like, oh, I didn't get my period this month, I must be training really hard, or I must be getting really lean, and that's a good thing. You know, particularly in the build-up to ultra-distance events like Comrades, it will be common for women to stop getting their period anytime from February onwards, and then they're like, no, it's cool because I'm in my high mileage phase, so it's cool, I've lost my period, no problem. And people think that's part of the process and something to strive to. Like, if you're still getting your period, you're clearly not doing it right. And I think that that's an extremely toxic and negative way of thinking. And the third thing that I've grown increasingly concerned about, and you know, I'm probably going to take a bit of flack for saying this, but increasingly as athletes become role models and leaders in their fields, they also become poster pinups, and they can be regarded as the epitome in not only sports performance, but in sport pictures. How do you look? Oh, look, that athlete looks like an athlete. Look how lean she is. Look how strong she is. Look how beautiful she is, or how muscular or strong or lean he is. And so your physical form is then taken on an aesthetic basis, and people strive to achieve that, whether or not that's healthy or not. I follow a lot of the US athletes, track and field, cross country, running, and I mean, I'm amazed at the difference in body shape that a lot of the local athletes have compared to international athletes. A lot of our international athletes are really, muscular and strong and look like they can run all day really fast, whereas many of our athletes are very thin and light, and I think, wow, if the wind picks up significantly, they're going to blow over. And I think we need to be careful about the sort of, I don't want to say the role models that we're picking, but I think we need to be careful about the sort of body image that we are portraying as what constitutes a healthy athlete. Because people come in all shapes, forms, and sizes, and it's not necessarily the case that you have to look like a supermodel to perform well. And I think that, in my past life or my earlier life, when I did suffer from anorexia, the perception was waif-like is better, leaner, smaller, skinnier is better, and it's faster. And that's not necessarily true. And so if I'm faster, stronger, and heavier, then so be it. And I think people need to realize that you've got to fuel the car properly in order to perform at its best. And really, if you're the kind of car that needs a high performance fuel and that involves a lot of calories, then so be it. And I think that's more the conversations that we need to be having, is about fueling for performance as opposed to fueling for aesthetics.
Yeah. No, thank you. That's everything I wanted you to say from that point. So well done. Thanks for that. I think one of the main parts of that I want to get out, because when I speak to athletes, is exactly, I'm missing my period. No, that's, and the doc, I'm sure, will back me up here, but that is a red flag. And it goes back onto this tracking of your menstrual cycle and symptoms. And I see most people say they've been doing it for years, and I'd love to know what they've been tracking or how they've then adjusted things specific to, Doc Puzzle mentioned it a bit earlier. There's looking at things from a health perspective or from a performance and training perspective. And so, I don't know, perhaps, Hales, before we go on to the contraception side of things, but, I think there's so much value in tracking your cycle. Doc, yeah, I mean, back me up on if you're not getting your period, it's a red flag, right? 100%. So we should be monitoring that.
Absolutely. And perhaps just to answer some of the questions that have come in, because I've been looking at them, that speak specifically to this, to period, reds, contraception. Maybe just to clarify a few things. So firstly, as we've said, that assuming you're not on any contraceptions, having a period is a normal physiological event for a female, and it should happen regularly, i.e. every month, about 28 days. Somebody asked, do you always lose your period when you have reds? And because the endocrine system, in other words, the hormone system, it's a really meticulously controlled system. God did well, if you believe in God, or biology is really well tuned and fine tuned in that way. So it's very sensitive to changes in stimulus and input. Very changes to stimulus and input, and therefore, yes, it often will be one of the first signs and early signs in females who are eumenoric that something is wrong, that there's an energy imbalance. I think it's important to also acknowledge that there are other reasons that one may not get their period, and common things occur commonly. So firstly, if you're pregnant, you won't get your period. And that's the most common reason that many women don't get their period. But in athletes who are training with high loads or have increased their training loads, relative energy deficiency syndrome is one of your top differential diagnoses. You would have to obviously go through a process as a physician to exclude other clinical causes of amenorrhea. As I said, the most common ones being pregnancy, breastfeeding, or menopause. But again, if in athletes, this would be high on your index of suspicion. And of course, as I've said, you'd look at a number of things to actually eventually come to that diagnosis. There are other reasons that people lose their period. Other than those top three, some could be medical conditions, some could be medication that you're on, some could be, as I said, other clinical conditions and cancers. So it's important to go through that list, but those things are less common than the ones that we're speaking about now. The other question that came up is around contraception. So I'm just looking at my notebook here because I made a note of it. And so the question is, could you get relative energy deficiency syndrome in sport if you're on a contraception, and how will you know? So again, just to maybe touch on the role of contraceptions. So many people who are on a contraception either don't get their period, or of course they're on it to regulate their period. The point of a contraception is to stop you from ovulating so that you don't fall pregnant, primarily, of course, so that you don't fall pregnant. So in those people, for example, who are on a Mirena or who are on an intrauterine device and do not get a regular period, it'll obviously be more difficult to use this as the early signal because you don't get your period anyway, right? So obviously a loss of a period won't be a sign of red necessarily. You would then probably, if again you're training at high loads, present with other symptoms. Like I've said, these perhaps recurrent injuries, atypical stress fractures or recurrent stress fractures. You might be that person who's constantly fatigued and again not able to reach their training thresholds. Falling sick, recurrently. So I'm that person who's now had flu or ear infection or a sore throat or just 5 times within a season when normally I don't get it. These are the signs that one would look at then if you're on a contraception that is already stopping you from getting your period. Hayley, do you want to take any more questions on REDS before we move it perhaps to contraception and then start addressing others? There's a lot of questions on polycystic ovarian syndrome, and I think this is a very, again, common cause of amenorrhea or abnormal menstruation or abnormal cycle rather in females. And so I can understand why there's so many questions that are coming on or coming in about polycystic ovaries. But perhaps once we've finished the crux and what you'd like to sort of chat with Amy, we can maybe touch on that. Or in fact, just have another webinar on PCOS and in fact, relative energy deficiency in sports syndrome.
No, absolutely. I think, as we said at the beginning, perhaps we were overzealous going on with these 3 quite broad and quite detailed topics, but it's definitely interesting, and we always have time for more seminars and more webinars down the line, webinars. But I think if that's okay, let's move more specifically onto contraception, and we will have time at the end to tackle a few more of those questions. And thank you, everybody. Please keep them coming because we can always answer them offline, and get back to you as well in that way. So, yeah, Doc, while I've got you here, basically what we wanted to look at with contraception is, I guess, what is the common contraceptive that athletes are using, that women are using, and perhaps what the choice or why the choice is to be going that route. And obviously, as you've explained, we know maybe the primary reason might be to not fall pregnant, but it's not always the case. Sometimes it's because we have slightly irregular periods, and it actually regulates things, especially with oral contraceptives. But as we've seen in the research and as we've discussed, there are pros and cons to which contraception you're on, to whether you're taking it and it's localized to one area, like the Mirena, or whether it's something that's sort of circulating through a whole system. So if you're willing to and great timing there for our poll to come up is just chat a little bit about maybe oral contraceptives versus our UIDs.
Absolutely.
Sorry,
so that's okay. So 2 common reasons, as you said, that many women in their reproductive age use a contraception. Firstly, to stop themselves falling pregnant. And then secondly, those women who've got menstrual irregularities. So in other words, either they're not getting a regular menstrual cycle, or they have dysmenorrhea. So in other words, menstrual symptoms that they want to moderate, essentially. So people who've got excessive PMS, who've got excessive bleeding, these are individuals who, even if they have a regular period, may choose or be prescribed a contraceptive in order to decrease those symptoms around them when they menstruate. So those are the 2 main reasons that people will go on it. In terms of the options, there's obviously a broad range of contraception that women can go on. But most commonly, women will go on what's called the combined oral contraception, or of course an IUD. Combined oral contraception really is, in other words, a pill. So that's an oral contraception. And combined usually means it's got a combination of estrogen and progesterone in different doses, depending on which pill you're on. Many women who go on an oral contraception after they have been pregnant, in other words, while they are still breastfeeding, will go on a progesterone-only one, and that's for reasons related to breastfeeding and child health. But most women who are in their reproductive years using a combination of estrogen and progesterone. The alternative, of course, to an oral contraception is using what you call an intrauterine device. So in other words, that would be something like a copper T or a marina that is inserted through the vagina, through the cervix and into the uterine, and essentially stays there and has local effects. In other words, has effects that are only localized to the uterus and the uterine wall. Pros and cons of either. And I think this conversation is certainly not long enough to go into the details of all of them. But essentially, the oral contraception works by taking a tablet with hormones for about 21 days. So from day one of your period for 21 days. And then for those last 7 days, usually you'll take what they call a sugar pill. In other words, there's nothing. And you get a withdrawal bleed. So the slide that you're looking at now essentially is what I talked you through earlier to make sure that we're on the same page. This looks at the hormones and how they essentially fluctuate or change through the cycle. And what you see essentially is that you get if I just look at estrogen, you'll get a peak in estrogen and a peak in progesterone. That's the purple and the black lines towards sort of just before your first half, and again, your second half of your cycle. And then the effect of the contraception, so if you just move to the next slide, Brad, is essentially it flattens that curve. So in other words, it suppresses your levels of estrogen and progesterone, okay, so that you don't get that luteinizing hormone spike, and essentially so that you don't ovulate. So this is just the summarized version, because what actually happens is it spikes every single day. So in other words, it spikes, you take the pill, it goes down. It spikes, you take the pill at the same time, it goes down. But the overall effect essentially is that you've got a leveling out of estrogen and progesterone throughout your whole cycle. So in other words, cycle I'm using loosely, throughout all of the days. And you only get a period, not because you ovulate, like people who are not on contraception, but because you stop taking this hormone and you get what's called a withdrawal bleed. So you're not ovulating when you're on birth control. One of the pros essentially of oral contraception obviously is you can start and stop when you want to, but you need to take it every day and need to be quite consistent about when you take it. One of the cons, of course, is if you forget to take it, you could ovulate and then fall pregnant. It's also got interactions with antibiotics and other medication, which could make it less effective. And that then brings you to the pros of an intrauterine device, which you essentially insert and you leave in your uterus for up to 5 years, most of them. And it affects local effects on the uterine wall, and essentially makes the uterus an inhospitable place, essentially. So not conducive to fertilizing sperm, housing sperm, or fertilizing rather even a fertilized egg. So that's how an IUD works locally, as opposed to an oral contraception, which essentially releases hormones throughout your whole body, and then obviously also affects your menstrual cycle. Hayley, is that clear, or are there any specific questions that want to be answered relative to that? Questions that we always get is, for those people, if you're not getting a period and you're on the contraception, is that healthy or is it not unhealthy? And without unequivocally, there are no, and I spoke to 3 gynaes today just to make sure that this is still the latest evidence. So there are no health consequences of being on a contraceptive pill or device and essentially not getting your periods. In other words, in the athletic population, because some people don't want to be racing while they're on their period, they often skip the sugar pills and go straight from day 1 to day 21 and then start again day 1 and carry on day 21. And the question is always, oh my word, isn't that not going to cause some kind of effect internally or health-wise? And the answer is no, it won't. But equally so, if you're on a marina or on an IUD and you don't get your period because of that localized effect, there are no sort of adverse health consequences because of the lack of period. I'm not talking about the hormone.
Sure. And I see what's also coming up, and I feel like it's going to put us with our backs against the wall. So I'm hoping you have a bit of insight into this. But if athletes are on something like the Mirena, where they now aren't having a period or sort of a bleed phase, how are we then going to help them to track the menstrual cycle with these fantastic apps that we've heard of and all this great advice we have around it? Do do we have an option? I, for example, never had a conscious period for 5 years when I was on the Mirena. So, you know, it's quite hard to track.
Absolutely. I think the short answer is it's very hard to track and it's very difficult. And in many people, women rather, they won't be able to track it because remember, you have now flattened your hormone profile. Therefore, you're not experiencing the changes in hormones which cause the symptoms, right, that you would experience, like your PMS and such. So in many women, they actually won't be able to track. And Anne has got great experience about how she navigated this herself. So in other words, she was also on a contraception. She became curious about tracking. And I won't tell your own story, Anne, but you can then advise sort of what you then did.
So I previously used the Mirena because, you know, I have previously thought that it was just a hack to have your period on race day, and I didn't want the drama of dealing with the period. And in any event, I was training like a man, and men don't have periods, so let's just not have one. Basically, that was how I was operating. And in my recovery from REDS, I realized that I needed to start tracking my period to track that I was being healthy, that I was eating properly, that I was recovering. And couldn't do it because wasn't getting a period. So how was I going to work out whether I was healthy or not, whether my hormones were back in sync, didn't know what to do. And so experimented in various ways. I tracked my temperature every morning for months on end, couldn't pick up a difference. Then spent hundreds of rands on urine dipsticks to try and pick up a difference in my luteinizing hormone each month. So when you come to ovulation, your luteinizing hormone goes up, and tried to pick up the rise in my luteinizing hormone, and then I would work out when I was ovulating. From then I could work out my cycle, and that didn't work. Couldn't, flunked my tests, wasn't picking up any difference in that. And then eventually went to my gynae and had my Mirena removed after 3 years, so early. Had the Mirena removed, waited for a regular period to come back, and then have tracked my period now through a couple of cycles, I'd say 4 or 5 cycles, to work out what my period is, how regular it is, what sort of time frame I'm working on, because not everybody has the same length period. It can be as short as 21 days, it can be as long as 45 days. So I wanted to work out whether I had a regular period. And now that I've worked out how long my cycle is, I've worked out that my period is regular, I am healthy. Now, because I am terrified of getting accidentally pregnant and messing up next year's Comrades, I'm going to have the Mirena put back in, and will then track it again, try and track it using hormones and urine tests. But also, now I know how long my cycle is, I can track it also by how I'm feeling in my training. So that's my plan. I can't tell you whether it works or not yet because I'm just getting started, but that has been my plan. So I did remove it, I've tracked it, I've checked that I'm healthy again, and I'm going to put it back in and monitor it going forward.
And thanks, Doc, as well. And I think a question that's come up, and maybe I can pose it to the two of you as well, is this idea of, I think a lot of athletes have experimented with trying to skip their sort of bleed phase if they are on oral contraceptives by, as you said, by not taking those sort of sugar pills. Is this something that is kind of understandable? And I don't want to say encouraged, but they've kind of said, is it worthwhile using as a strategy? What would your advice be? And I had a friend of mine who's a Comrades runner say to me this week, if I know I'm going to have a heavy period on the day of Comrades, I want to stop that.
Or maybe I can give it a go first. It depends why, right? And what you're going to be doing and why you want to stop it. So if you're going for a swim, or in fact, let me not use a swim because that's a little bit controversial depending on, what kind of sanitary wear you use. But I mean, if you're just training regularly and there's no specific competition or any reason for you not to get your period, then I would say, stick with the normal combined oral contraception. In other words, take the sugar pills, get your period, and carry on with the normal cycle. But of course, if you are a competitive athlete in the world of sports medicine and elite sport, it is a strategy that is commonly requested and therefore used, in other words, to skip that menstruation, that period. And that is because it may be disruptive. So you've mentioned, as an example, a Comrades runner who's going to be on the road. Now, it depends how fast you are, but who's going to be on the road for a sustained duration of time. And of course, if you're an elite runner What you're not wanting to do is stop to change your tampon. I mean, where you're changing your tampon and all of that, of course. If you're racing for time, put it in position. And in those cases, or an equally important event, and choose your event, whatever it might be. So runners may then choose to not experience their period. And it is perfectly safe to do so. So in other words, to not take the sugar pill and immediately take the next day 1 pill, right? So that's how you would do it. So it's literally just going day 1 to 21, and then the day of your sugar pill, you don't take the sugar pill and start the new pack and start at day 1. That's how you do it. And then, of course, if you want to have the withdrawal bleed at any point, in other words, if you feel comfortable and you're the type of woman who wants to have a period every month, and of course, after the race, you can just start the sugar pills. And that would be that. You'd get the withdrawal bleed after a few days, and then you start again and you resume your combined oral contraception. So I think that's an important thing. It's just why you're doing it. Is it important? If you're the type of person who doesn't want to have your period, then you've got other options available to you. And Anne has mentioned, things that are maybe more convenient as a way of contraception. If you don't want to have your period, and of course, if you want to guarantee that you don't fall pregnant, want a more foolproof way, then you would use something like the intrauterine device, because obviously you don't have to think about that. And I'm not sure if you've got anything to add to that.
So just the research that I looked into earlier this year was related to how athlete performance responds to different times in your cycle. And I know you've already been through the graph and indicated your low hormone phase and your high hormone phase. But the research that I was looking into, and certainly which sort of found a home with me, is that in the first half of your cycle, you perform better. You're able to hit higher intensities. You're more closely aligned to men during that period. So that's from day 1 of your bleed until when you ovulate is your low hormone phase. And I found that to be true. I found that basically day 1 of my period is I feel like a machine. I sit 5K PBs on that day. I whack up my 400 meters on that day. Like, I feel invincible. It doesn't matter that I happen to be having a period on that day. So if I was like, oh, wow, Comrades race day happens on day 1 of my period, I'd be like, whoa, I'm in for a good run. But that's not the same for everybody. And it certainly wouldn't be the case if you suffer from PMS. So if on day 1 of your period, you're going to be bloaty and crampy and have back pain and feel really fatigued, then obviously that's not something you want to explore. So I do think that it's really individual. How you feel on day 1 of your period or during that week of having your period is completely individual. And whether or not that's a day that you're going to perform well or not really depends on who you are. So for me, yeah, that would be great. For somebody else, maybe it doesn't work so well. So I think that this is another reason why it's really important to track your period and to work on how you're feeling on different days during your period. Because, for example, if you needed to accommodate that by adjusting your cycle, and it's not something that I advocate, but say that you had to, if you had a heavy bleed and you were going to be on the road all day and you didn't want to change your tampon, if that's something that you needed to adjust for, then plan for it in advance, because it's going to affect your performance on that day. But if it's not going to affect your performance, you're going to have a good day, then that's not something you're going to have to think about. But it's really hugely individual.
Sorry, do we lose Anne there? But I maybe just I think we might have lost Anne, but maybe just to follow on from what Anne is saying, I think. Yeah, there's the contraceptive way of doing what you're saying, Doc, and not getting your period on that day. But a lot of some of the research that I've also read is around utilizing training and nutrition aspects to help you through certain phases of your cycle to mitigate some of those symptoms, which again is where the tracking aspect comes in quite strongly. And Hayley and I have had this conversation separately, but around. If you're not using the oral contraceptive and you can't manipulate your cycle that way, what in race week is happening and you don't feel as strong as Anne does on day 1, because I know I definitely don't feel as strong as Anne will on any given day, let alone on day 1 of my cycle. But for the most part, so what can you do to help some of those things? And I've read a little bit around, particularly, and I know we didn't touch on this when you were going through the cycle, but there's a higher inflammatory response in some aspects or in some parts of your cycle, and therefore utilizing nutritional aspects to perhaps, not I want to say like superimpose that inflammatory responses. That's sort of what we've been looking at quite a bit at Coach Parry. But yeah, your thoughts on that, Doc, as well?
Very, very briefly, because I'm aware of time. You're very right, Shona. It's thought that there's certain physiological changes in even insulin sensitivity, carbohydrate metabolism, what did you just mention now, inflammation. And these all may influence your training response. So in other words, in the first half of the cycle, actually, it's thought that you're more insulin sensitive. So in other words, you're more efficient at how you metabolize carbohydrates. Some research has shown this. So again, it might also be a contributor to why you might train well during this time, other than the hormone profile, but also your response to insulin and carbohydrates and energy utilization. Whereas in the second half of your cycle, you are less energy efficient. So just in terms of speaking practically, we spoke a lot about people who are on a contraception and what they can do to then manipulate or influence whether or not they get a period. But obviously the key factor here would be, if you're not one who's doing it for performance, would be managing your symptoms, right? So it really would depend on what symptoms you get. A lot of people start feeling bloated, they're lethargic, they have cravings, PMS, and then obviously leading into the menstrual cycle. And so what you want to do is there are dietary strategies that you can start engaging in to just manage those symptoms. Eating smaller meals more regularly, decreasing the fat content and even the sort of refined glucose and carbohydrate content in your meals might assist with those symptoms and lessen those symptoms and lessen the cravings and even those sugar spikes and then dips, and so the lethargy and the fatigue. There have been other things around PMS. So I think I read recently about primrose oils and other sort of supplementary herbal remedies that you can take. Now, I must put a disclaimer here. As a sports medicine physician who deals with elite athletes, when it comes to supplements or any herbs or anything like that, I would say don't do it until you consult or you check with your anti-doping list. But there are natural ways in which you can also lessen the symptoms of PMS and therefore its effect on your training and or performance.
I love what you're saying, Doc, and I think one of the pertinent things for me here, and Anne mentioned it as well, is that everyone is going to be different, right? So what we're saying here is really a lot of the averages, it's a lot of what science has put forward, but a lot of that's done on different studies. We touched on that earlier, but I think the key thing is around each individual female athlete tracking and understanding how their body works, because I come from a science background, and so we love data, right? And we love looking at this stuff and looking back at things in retrospect. But if you as a female understand how your body works month in, month out, or 34 days in, 34 days out, or 21 days in, 21 days out, or even on an IUD, I think understanding those things is where a lot of, I want to say you can start empowering yourself as a female athlete and understanding how your body is responding to certain foods, certain training modalities. And Brad's just popped that up there, but exactly for that reason, we're wanting to create this menstrual cycle tracker. And this will be linked quite a bit with your way you train and the things you're doing during training and your nutritional aspects that you're putting in. And the important stuff with that is for you as an athlete to start understanding how you are responding with your cycle and the things that are working for you. I think, again, the important bits, and Hales and I have touched on this so often, I'll just see that pop up there. If you're wanting to get sort of early bird access to this app, click on there and we'll get it sent to you when it's out and ready to roll out. But the really important thing around this is making sure that you're doing things that are specific to you at the right sort of times. And more importantly, a lot of coaches have this idea of you're female, just do less, and no, it's not about that. It's about moving things to suit your training and your symptoms and the way you're responding at the right sort of time. So you're still going to be hitting the same volumes of training and the same intensities, but just, I want to say, instead of working against your menstrual cycle, working with it and optimizing your training from there. So, Hales, I don't know if there's anything you want to add on that, but guys, this I think it's about empowering yourself as a female athlete, using the tools that are there to really make yourself a bit more aware of what's going on in your own body, having these conversations with the right sort of people, and listening to Anne and Hayley and Doc Phatho and some of the information that we're bringing here, because I do think there's a lot of misinformation out there as well. So, Hales, I think maybe some time to crack on with some questions, perhaps, because I know there have been tons and we haven't got to a whole lot of them. But
Yeah, for sure. I think it's been great, and thanks everyone for just the consistent flow of questions coming through. We are seeing them all, and I've just noticed in particular there's been a lot of questions around menopause specifically, and yeah, I think you'll agree, and I did try and answer there that we definitely could have probably a whole webinar. A whole
Well,
webinar.
let's call it. I think we should call them webinars. That's a great idea.
Exactly. But also that we will be releasing some content, some sort of shorter videos on that subject as well. We also just discussed today that menopause is not something that you worry about when it hits you or when you're the older athlete. There seems to be a lot to be said for what we can do now as younger athletes to try and mitigate and sort of decrease some of those effects later on. Because from at least my sort of, relatively layman's terms of understanding is that we don't want to just get there and then deal with it. Like in some ways that's too late, because then we're basically just kind of patting out fires. Not to be too sort of anti it, but I do think that there's a lot we can do now. We can empower ourselves, and I'm sure we'd have a lot of content to share on that. But one question that's popped up, and it's a very simple question, but I think it will resonate with all of us, is one of the ladies asked, if my period stops, should I stop running? And I'd love to hear what Doc or Ann think on that, and Shona, even you as well, because I don't think it's as simple as, oh yes, stop running, but we do know that that's going to be a flag and possibly your training load as a contributor.
Yeah, happy to hear Doc's answer as she pops up.
Absolutely.
Doc, you take that and then I can answer after you.
I'll be very short. I think if your period stops, the first thing you need to ask yourself is why, right? So that would be my first thing, is find out why your period has stopped. Are you pregnant? If you're not pregnant, because common things occur commonly, then there must be an underlying why. Have you increased your, then you start working through everything else, and there's a number of reasons. So if your period stops, should you stop running? If it's just your period and you're feeling 100% in tops, no. Let's answer why first before you stop running. But obviously part of the workup might include you decreasing your training load in order to see if your period returns or if that might be the primary cause. But I think my short answer is no. Primarily, find out the diagnosis. In other words, get a diagnosis first, and then take it from there.
Doc, you've hit the nail on the head there. I won't add anything onto that. Wait for Hales to pop back up and we can take a couple more questions. I'm scrolling through as we're going through, and I see we've answered some of them as we've gone through. But yeah, I think while Hales is coming back on, I think the point I was trying to make around if you're not getting your period, it's not just a one instance. Monitor that over time, and if that is a continuous not getting your period for a number of months, that's perhaps where the concern is. But however, like Doc had answered, there are many factors that could go into that.
Yeah,
Hello, Hales.
I think a lot of the questions coming through for me, and I'll leave you guys to agree or disagree, is relating to like personal experience. So should I go with the IUD? Should I go with oral contraceptive? People are also asking, what would we recommend? Do you use a menstrual cup versus do you use a tampon? And Doc, I'm sure you agree, like so much of this is individual specific. So I guess what we're trying to do is provide some research, provide some answers. Some of it's anecdotal, and I would say like anything is practice all of it, try all of it, and then try and work out what works for you. And if it's as simple as tracking your symptoms in a diary on a piece of paper, a couple of months down the line, you'll have a little bit more knowledge, and then you can, then compare notes and compare stories based on these experiences that have been shared today and this advice.
Absolutely. And maybe just to take it a step further, Hayley, I think this is the first step. Obviously, just being empowered with certain knowledge is the starting point. And then exploring different concepts yourself, doing your own research. But of course, there's people and there's experts that are available to assist you on this journey. And I'm not just talking about sports physicians. I'm talking, depending on the extent of your problem or your curiosity, of course, go to a sports scientist who can help you with things around your training schedule. Go to a gynecologist, of course, if you're having menstrual irregularities that actually need further investigation. A sports physician is also a great starting point. But just importantly, there are people who can help you along this journey. As you've said, you're going to be releasing more information. And I think a great idea would probably be to do a Q&A based on some of these questions to publish on the Coach Parry page so that we make sure that we address some of the more pertinent ones.
I'm going to do Absolutely. I'm sure Shones will reflect
Doc,
a little
I think
bit
that's
on
a great point. I'll make a note of that, and we'll
brilliant.
We'll questions for sure, and because there's so many, and they're all really excellent. This is the first of a many-part series, and we'll be touching on a lot of these discussions. But I love that idea. I'm very happy to put together that Q&A. Hopefully, the gents who are working in the background have noticed that, and they can start getting those questions ready for us. I'd love that.
Shones, if I could cut in there, I think Doc, there's a good question that's come through here from Laura. And thanks, Laura, for your personal experience there. And I'm just going to read it to all of you. As someone who hasn't had a period for years, but has never been sick or injured throughout a sporting career and has been able to handle high load and intensity of training, Laura, you are a super athlete, and has good bone health, etc. How do you get them to then value the benefit of a period? And sorry, Laura, you might have been talking about somebody else, but I think it is a good question, because if you haven't had any of these scary symptoms, exactly, do we then still value the benefit of a period?
So again, I think what we were trying to illustrate is having a period, again, as a normal physiological reaction, if I can call it that, outcome of a normal physiological process. Many people don't have a period because they're on contraception for 20, 30, 40 years. And that's fine if they're not, as you said, they don't experience any health or performance problems. Remember, our goal here, mine at least primarily, is firstly to maintain and then optimize health. And then secondly, of course, is to maintain and optimize performance. So if you have no health concerns and you don't have a period because you're on contraception, then this is perfectly fine. All right, then there's nothing to investigate. If you're comfortable like that. The only reason we would investigate or start tracking is, for instance, as Ann said, Ann started to notice that she might be affected. So I was curious about if she could improve her performance by changing her training to adapt it to a period. Of course, other people start having health issues. In other words, as I've mentioned them before, recurrent infections, recurrent injuries. I keep on saying these things because I hope it'll land somewhere, or somewhere down the line. If it does happen to you, it might trigger thoughts. If this is perhaps the problem. So if you're having health problems or performance issues, then it becomes reasons to start breaking it down and saying, what can I do to then address my health firstly, and optimize or maintain my health and performance? And of course, regulating your period, monitoring and tracking your period might be one of the things that you want to do. Does that make sense, Hayley?
It does to me. And if I can add on or touch on what you said at the very beginning, which was, why are you not having the period? Because for sure, it probably is quite convenient to not have it. And as athletes, we get quite sort of blinkers on, and we're driven towards goals and focus. But when you're no longer trying to be on the podium and you want to start a family, then you have to look back and go, oh, maybe I should have been more conscious about not having a period for 8 years or 10 years. Surely then it could become a factor.
Yeah, sorry, Hayley, I must be very clear. And that's why I said, if you're on a contraception, if you're not on a contraception or contraceptive device or pill, and you're not getting period, this is not normal. This is not okay. And there are significant health consequences. Even if you're apparently not experiencing the more severe ones that I've spoken about, but if you're not getting a period and you're still performing, in other words, you're meddling or podiuming, but you're not getting it and you're not in a contraception, then this is not okay, because there are long-term health consequences, even if the short-term ones you're not experiencing. The long-term ones primarily being related to fertility, you hit the nail on the head, and of course bone health, which is something that you can't reverse 10, 20 years down the line if, again, you've lost your period because you're training too much, or let's use the appropriate word, because of energy availability problems.
Sure. And Doc, as we said, we've had so many questions about menopause, and so much of that is your bone mineral density down the line. And again, here we go. If we've overlooked having a menstrual cycle without being on an oral contraceptive all those years, we are predisposing ourselves to having those long-term negative factors, are we not?
Absolutely, yes. And as I said, it's not something we can reverse, which is why, as you said, it needs to be addressed in the short term. There are a few questions about how you track ovulation, and perhaps that can be answered in a Q&A, because again, the question would be why you're tracking ovulation. So absolutely, there's the more rudimentary measures, like they say that there's a slight spike in your temperature, basal temperature, just before ovulation. So these are what traditionally people use to monitor their cycle. And obviously, if you're trying to fall pregnant or avoid pregnancy, when your basal temperature spikes, then you know that you're about to ovulate. And so that's when you either do what needs to be done to fall pregnant or don't, okay, around that period. But obviously that's flawed in its way, because there's a number of reasons why your basal metabolic rates or temperature rather could increase. And then of course these days there's things like urine tests. Again, there's a spike in LH which you can pick up in the urine just before ovulation. And absolutely there are blood tests, but those are expensive, and you need to ask yourself why what are you tracking, why are you tracking? And you would definitely do these blood tests if you suspect any sort of underlying clinical reasons and you're trying to investigate amenorrhea or an absence in period, but it's certainly nothing that we would do routinely, just for the sake of doing it. But again, we can answer that in detail, perhaps in a Q&A.
Doc, there's a few questions on Red S, and I know you and Anne has had personal experience, and just from your experiences, there's two questions that has come up once or twice. One is how is Red S diagnosed? And I know there's specific categories of high risk, medium risk, low risk. And then the next one, and it's come up twice, is how would you start the process of treating Red S, or how do you treat Reds? Once almost diagnosed, what is the process thereafter? And so maybe between you and Anne, just tackling that one before we kind of close off, because I think that's been quite a big discussion tonight.
Okay. So I'll give very sort of high-level answers to both of those questions, and of course, depending on the follow-up questions, we can go into detail, or in fact, again, Q&A forum afterwards. But just in terms of making a diagnosis, first and foremost, it's a clinical diagnosis. So you would first have a high level of suspicion based on certain risk factors. So importantly, sort of the type and the profile of athletes, often those athletes that need to be lean for their sport. So ballet dancers, gymnasts, even cyclists and rowers, in other words, that compete according to weight categories or aesthetics, would often be those athletes that restrict their calorie intake in order to maintain that weight or physique. So that would be a risk factor. And then, of course, there's other risk factors related to training load, increase in training load. So you'd look at risk factors first. That would give you a high index of suspicion. And then, of course, clinically, as I said, I've mentioned the symptoms. I feel like a broken record. Things like if an athlete comes to you and they no longer have their menstrual cycle, but used to have one, that would be something that increases your index of suspicion. And then all the other symptoms that I've spoken about around recurrent injuries, stress fractures, so on and so forth. The clinical syndrome, the clinical picture would give you a high index of suspicion. And then you could do follow-up things. So if you suspect, for instance, and you're wanting to confirm whether there has been an effect on one of the early indicators, as I said, is bone health. So you'd get those recurrent stress fractures. You can do what's called a DEXA. So it's a specific kind of scan that essentially gives a report or feedback on your bone health, your bone mineral density. And that might give you an indication. So there's a certain Z score or score below which at different points or different vertebrae, you would know that you are osteopenic, so you have decreased bone mineral density. And that again adds to the clinical syndrome and the combination of symptoms and signs that could essentially confirm a diagnosis of Red S rather. So it's a number, it's not just one thing. So in other words, it's not just an absence of a period. It's not just a low bone mineral density in isolation. It's a combination of factors of clinical signs and symptoms, which would then lead you to that diagnosis, in short. You could obviously also take a number of blood tests, but you'd be looking at, again, specific markers or biomarkers. And again, it wouldn't be one in isolation. Then just in terms of management, I think there's 3 cornerstone areas that you would look at. If you just, again, go back to how you come to a state energy imbalance or insufficient energy. So really the cornerstone of treatment is around looking at nutrition, looking at training load, and then looking at your level of recovery. And that's obviously oversimplified. So what you want to try get is you want to increase your energy availability by either decreasing training load, increasing caloric intake or energy intake, and of course ensuring that you have enough recovery in order to maintain the changes that you need to be able to tolerate. That's very simplified, and you're welcome to add.
Yeah, so I mean, I actually didn't know I had Red S until a coach that I was working with before I joined, Coach Parry, said to me, look, you're not responding to your coaching, you're not responding to the workouts, you're feeling rubbish all the time, maybe you should go and have some blood tests done, maybe you need to consider this medically. And looking back, I clearly had signs of Red S and had signs of Red S for at least 2 years. But just going over my notes from that Dr. Sims course that I did earlier this year, some of the things that you first started to identify, or I first should have flagged as indicators of a problem for me, particularly since I was on the Mirena at the time and so wasn't having a period, and so that wasn't an easy indicator for me personally, but inability to reach goal weight. Could not lose weight even when I was dieting because my body had entered into a state of crisis and was therefore retaining all the fat that it could, all the nutrients that it could. So I couldn't reach goal weight easily despite dieting. So that would have been an easy sign. Putting on belly fat. Belly fat is not something that I have or usually have. It's not something that I'm familiar with, but suddenly started to put on a lot of belly fat, couldn't shake it despite doing 60 million sit-ups, despite dieting. That would have been an indicator that something was wrong with my nutrition. Feeling flat all the time, sleeplessness, lethargy, moodiness, sort of fundamental changes in my mood and how I was feeling. Again, not responding to training, not being able to finish a workout, seeing stars while I was running. Those all should have been clear warning signs to me that there was a problem with my body. And despite seeing, various sports practitioners, all of them assumed that I was eating lots of food and so would have been healthy. I felt like I was eating lots of food and I was healthy, but for me, it wasn't the right type of food, and that's not something that we've touched on today. But, a big part of Red S can not only be your total energy intake, but energy intake from the right sources, and that's another whole ball game to have a debate on. But, for me, those things, it wasn't right. I didn't feel right. I wasn't able to lose my goal weight. I wasn't able to reach my training targets despite training really hard. Onset of body fat, huge mood swings and differences. I just wasn't myself. And without, I just needed to understand why that was happening to me. And that's what set me on the path of trying to find out what was going on. And so if you are experiencing those things, whether or not you have a period or not, there are other ways to investigate whether or not you're in a state of low energy availability. And I strongly recommend that people pay attention to that.
If I can just draw on one more question here, and Shona, I'm not sure how much time we put aside or how much time our viewers are willing to spend still chatting to us.
I can talk about it. I can go all night. I mean, I'm happy to chat all night, but I'm respectful of everyone's time. Yeah.
But I do think this ties in a lot with what Anne was just touching on, and I think like menopause, we could probably have a whole webinar on nutrition. But a question that has come up, and I see a few people have said, "Oh yes, I want to know that too," was if you're on the keto diet, could that lead to, what was the exact wording, could you end up with Red S? And in my limited knowledge, I'm quite interested to see what maybe the knee-jerk reactions are to that question because of the relationship of carbohydrate and estrogen, and maybe the over-occurrence of too much protein instead of carbohydrate. Anyone keen to share their their feelings on that? And again, please, everyone, this is so individual specific. So like we've said many times, it depends on you and your body in particular and the way you're training and fueling.
If I just turn off my camera, can I let Doc I was going to say, I'm going to turn off my camera, Doc, and you can dive right in. First up, I'm not a nutritionist, so it's not really my expertise. Yeah. But Doc, you go ahead, and then I'll give my 2 cents after that.
So I think based on Anne's feedback as well, what I did want to emphasize in terms of the management of Red S is the importance of having just a multidisciplinary approach. So Anne also describes the complexity of her symptoms. And I think it mustn't be under the process of coming back from that or coming out of it or managing it mustn't be undermined or underestimated. And so I think it is really important at this particular point to say, especially in people who have got confirmed or diagnosed Red S, having a dietitian or dietitian essentially on site and on board is a really important part of your management process. So just about the question in terms of your keto diet, could it contribute to red S? Well, invariably yes, because just regardless of which diet you're on, if you're not consuming enough energy for your energy expenditure, you could absolutely end up in a state where you don't, of basically insufficient energy availability. So regardless of the diet. Again, you can train for different diets, and different people's bodies respond differently to different diets. So there are podium athletes right now, marathon runners who are on ketogenic diets and are doing really well. And you'll have heard of some of them, who speak quite openly and share a lot of their philosophies and their programs, and they're doing really well. There are other people who absolutely do not tolerate it. And actually, many women don't tolerate ketogenic diets as well as men do. Again, it's because of our process of physiology and our dependence on carbohydrates for certain physiological and metabolic processes, some people. And so what has been found earlier is that I'm generalizing here, please, that women may respond less to ketogenic diets than men do, generalizing, right? I think it's important to put that disclaimer. But it's a very difficult question to answer, with a blanket question. And I must be honest and say, I don't know the physiological, I'd have to think about it a little bit more to be able to give you a detailed answer in terms of the physiological processes and whether that would contribute to REDS. But what I can say is it might contribute to energy availability mismatch, just as any diet could if you're not matching your output with your input.
I'm not going to add on to that because you hit everything I wanted to hit in that answer, and I think it's so individual and so I think it's about weighing up the expenditure with the intake completely. And so if you're not, it's about, and hit the nail on the head as well. It's around the right sort of foods as well. So and that is so individual. So and again, I think. There's so many aspects, and we were quite ambitious with some of the topics we wanted to speak about tonight, but we haven't even ventured into enough around Red S or Reds. We will most definitely be having another webinar like this where we do focus on nutrition, and we'll have an expert in nutrition coming on and giving their input from there, because while Doc is extremely knowledgeable, and it's definitely not my field. I think that would be an extremely interesting conversation to have around nutrition. Menopause is definitely another one, and peri and post-menopause are some things, and strength training, which is my favorite thing, but we haven't even really touched on some of that. So, but aside from that, just I'm just cognizant of people's times. We do have that YouTube channel, and you guys can subscribe to that, where we have started to answer some of these questions. And if you subscribe to the channel, we can get to some of those more in depth. But I think Hales, maybe. Then we can call it for tonight, because otherwise, again, I mean, the four of us have had a brief conversation, and we spoke very quickly before this webinar. And, I'm so excited about this chat and opening up these conversations, but we could really do this for the entire evening if we carry on.
Yeah, I agree. So I just think a huge thanks to firstly the panel that we had tonight. So to Doc and to Anne for your contribution tonight, and for Coach Parry for getting us all together. I think a huge thanks to Coach Parry, because a lot of the comments that have come through have just said thank you. It's valid content. It's really worthwhile conversations that possibly we aren't having enough, that there's a little bit of a taboo associated with. And the more we can talk, the more we can share experience, the better we all learn. Whether we're athletes or coaches, or, as I said earlier, concerned spouses or parents. So that's been really helpful. So thanks to all of you. The comments, the questions, I mean, they just haven't stopped coming in. So that's been brilliant. Thanks for the support. And as Shona said, and as Brad has put up on the chat there, we do have links to our YouTube channel, where there are already some content videos, and there will be more content videos coming through on some of the subjects we've discussed tonight. And you're welcome to suggest other topics you'd like us to tackle, but as we've said, menopause, perimenopause, it's pretty much next on our list, as well as nutrition. So stay tuned, and it's been fantastic to interact with all of you. I've loved it. I've learned so much. It looks like a lot of you have as well. And yeah, it was a great privilege to hear from Ann's side of her racing experience, but as well as from Doc Phatho. So thank you very much.